Good evening and welcome. I'm Helen Malco, Program Manager for the Fellowship Program for Emerging Displaced Scholars at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. This fellowship program supports scholars in the humanities and social sciences who have been displaced from their home countries and institutions because of war and conflict. I am delighted today to welcome our distinguished speakers, Yanis Hamilakis, the Joukowsky Family Professor of Archaeology and Professor of Modern Greek Studies at Brown University, and Nawar Binyahoyada, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University. Also, I would like to welcome our audience from the MENA region and around the world. This conversation on the global phenomenon of migration comes at an important time as crisis of forced and undocumented migration continues in several parts of the world, with even more challenges exacerbated by the current pandemic. As many of us know, refugee communities throughout the world have been among the most vulnerable and have been affected severely by the political, economic, and humanitarian effects of this pandemic. Today's webinar will expand the scope of our understanding of human movement and displacement to include not only the movement of people, but also their things as they move through landscapes. Indeed, as humans move around, objects, things, and artifacts move with them, crossing borders and accumulating in transitional spaces, entry points, and borderlands. The book, The Nomadic Age of the New Nomadic Age, Archaeologies of Forced and Undocumented Migration, utilizes the field of contemporary archaeology to make a significant contribution to the understanding of the material, sensorial, and temporal dimensions of this phenomenon. In conversation with Yanis is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University, Nawar Binyahoyada. Nawar's research focuses on unauthorized migration, criminal justice, the aftermath of development, and transnational political imaginaries in the Central and Eastern Mediterranean. He is the author of several articles and books about the different phases of the dynamic of maritime unauthorized migration and interdiction. Before I hand over to Nawar and Yanis, I would like to remind our audience that you can send your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time during this webinar. Also, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of this book, a link will be shared with you in the chat box where you can buy a copy. With that, I would like to thank everyone in our virtual audience for joining us today, and I hand it over to you, Nawar.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you to the Columbia Global Center in Amman for hosting this conversation. And thank you, Yanis, for accepting the invitation to have this conversation about the work, about the book, about the exhibition. Let me start just by saying a bit more about how to say your trajectory before arriving to this project. You studied at first in University of Crete and then University of Sheffield. And then before coming to Brown University, you taught at Wales Lampeter and in Southampton in the United Kingdom. You've been fellow at the Getty Research Institute in LA, the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, and the Remark Institute in New York, among various other fellowships. Yanis's research and teaching interests include socio-political perspectives on the past, the bodily senses, archaeology of eating and drinking, the ontology and materiality of photography, the archaeology of nationalism, which I'll come to in a second, archaeological ethnography, and critical pedagogy in archaeology. And Yanis's main geographical research has focused on Greece and the Aegean, although much of his work has to do with prehistoric, Neolithic, and Bronze Age Aegean. He's equally interested, especially as we should see today, in archaeology of the contemporary. And in fact, many of your current projects are multi-temporal, combining various periods. So I want to start by saying a word about each of your previous main books for 2007 and 13 as we approach the current project. So, 1 second. So in the nations and in ruins, you examine how classical. Can you see the screen? Yes. Yeah. In nations and in ruins, archaeology, antiquity, and national imagination in modern Greece. You examine how classical antiquities and archaeology contributed significantly to the production of the modern Greek nation and its national imagination. And you show how, in return, national imagination has created and shaped classical antiquities and archaeological practice from the 19th century to the present. Several years later, in 2013, you published Archaeology and the Senses, Human Experience, Memory, and Affect, where you look at how archaeology is dealt with bodily senses, and you argue that archaeology can offer a richer glimpse into the human sensory experience, which again is something we will come to discuss later. And using the Bronze Age Crete as the case study, you show how sensorial memory can help us rethink questions ranging from the production of ancestral heritage to large-scale social change and cultural significance of monuments. Now, in the volume that, in the book that we're discussing today that came out of the project and the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology special issue, it's the first attempt to bring together the various people who are working on how different archaeologies think about this kind of work, archaeology of the contemporary, undocumented and forced migration. Now, in the couple of minutes that I have, I'll kind of mention various chapters in the book as I speak about what is the introduction. And the introduction pushes archaeology on the one hand to consider its role and its engagement with contemporary undocumented and forced migration. And you showcased to wider academic and non-academic publics what archaeology can bring to the discussion of these dynamics in these situations, and how archaeologists' sensibilities and methods can illuminate those ways in a way that, let's say, ethnographic anthropology cannot do. Now, the kinds of contribution that the book poses stems from the fact that while undocumented migration is central today, the materiality and the sensorial and mnemonic dimensions of these dynamics are still very much understudied. Let's take one example. Landscape can become a crucial material agent in processes of border crossing, and what in the article by Jason Delon and his collaborators and by Gabriele Soto in a different way, the landscape becomes an ally almost of the forces that seek to deter migrants from crossing borders. Materiality can be encountered also by the remnants left on the routes, again in the case of Gabriele Soto, or on the vessels in the case of the Tudo, the boat that is anchored in Sydney. It can also, materiality and mnemonic dimensions emerge from the houses and the places and the families of the people who left behind or were left behind as people migrate. So overall, the book presents not just the archaeology of the contemporary border crossing, but actually about the route, about the houses, about the vessels, about the memories, about the relationships. It includes contributions from archaeologists, anthropologists, and other specialists, artists, activists, including items by migrants themselves in different media. And it poses the following questions. First, how can we record, how can we explore and understand the materiality of the experience of forced and undocumented migration today in its diverse forms? How can we communicate it and communicate the work that we do to scholars and to various publics? And finally, what kind of theoretical and what kind of methodological stances can we deploy in order to avoid the instrumentalization, the aestheticization of the phenomenon for purely academic purposes, or generally the aestheticization of often painful and tragic experiences? And in a way to approach these three questions, the book and the introduction pose four multiple dimensions of undocumented migration that the archaeologists of it could pursue. And the first is the sensorial material. For example, the securitization of human mobility, as in the case of the Mexico-US border. the militarization of the border, as in your own work, which we'll see later with examples in exhibitions from Lesbos. The second is the epistemic dimensions and level of undocumented migration, the ways in which the archaeological approach can illuminate the way we understand the experience beyond, let's say, the strictly visual and strictly digital. The other dimension is the affective, in which these kind of archaeologists can foreground the material traces and the things that enable us to be moved and mobilized. And I think for me, both the article about the boat, the tudo, the juxtaposition of the image taken by the photographer when it happened and now when it's all prepped up as a museum item, and the article and the chapter about Albanian homes drive that point really strongly. And finally, the archival dimension of undocumented migration, that an archaeology can help, because it can help create a counter archive and a counter repository that serves. So, the first question I would like to ask you, in a second, is how. So from your work on the nation and its ruins, to this current project, what was your trajectory? How you came to work about this complex set of dynamics?
Thank you very much, Noor. First of all, hello everybody, and I would like to start by saying a few thanks, because I think it is important to acknowledge all our debts, and I have accumulated many throughout these years when I've started working on this project. First of all, thank you to the Columbia Global Centers and its staff. Thank you, Noor, for agreeing to discuss with me. A big thank you to the people of Lesbos, to migrating people, border crossers, but also people who live there and are active for many years now in many initiatives to do with border crossing and migration. Thank you to many NGOs and groups and organizations like the Waves of Hope for the Future, an Afghani organization I work closely with, Lesbos Solidarity, Art Bridges, Refocus Media, and many others. And finally, many thanks to the contributors of the book. As you know, this was a collective effort, and I'm grateful that so many of my colleagues and others agreed to write, express their thoughts, and explore this topic with me. Now, to get to your first question, you've already outlined some of the kind of themes that I've been working for many years. I want to say a word about nationalism, because I think that work on nationalism has been crucial for me in shaping my thinking on how I want and whether I want to get involved in that broader issue of contemporary migration. As you know, nations and nationalism is about imagination, it's about imagined communities, but it's also about the border. As we know, the border as a concept is central in constituting the whole concept of the nation. The border as a physical, material reality, but also the border as a way of thinking, as a way of imagining, as a way of producing otherness. And I have seen through my work on nationalism how bordering and the bordering effect of the nation has been working in the case of Greece since the 19th century. So in this new work, what I see in a physical border now is the production of otherness today. I can see also how certain features of national imagination are being reshaped in the contemporary moment. I can see how ideas about race, ideas about racialization are played out in the contemporary moment in that specific border locality I've been working. So I see this new project as a kind of continuation in some way of that work on the nation, but making it more specific and making it more contemporary in many ways. My second theme and thread that relates to the project is the archaeology of contemporary and archaeological ethnography. As you said, my work is not really focused on one specific period. My conventional training was in prehistory. I do excavate prehistoric sites, and I do believe in the value and the creative effect of doing that. But at the same time, I do not really believe in an archaeology that focuses on the archaeos, on antiquity, or on the ordinary. I believe in an archaeology that is about materiality and temporality, and the intersection between the two, the interplay between the two, the dialectic between materiality and temporality. In that sense, any material reality of whatever period chronologically defined is important within that expansive definition of archaeology. I've also been doing a lot of ethnographic work in my other archaeological projects. And that ethnographic work allowed me to not only appreciate the value of encounters, interactions with interlocutors, but also to understand better the process of materiality and temporality in its various time scales. And finally, I want to emphasize that throughout my engagement with archaeology, I believed in the agentic and important role of archaeologists as intellectuals in the present, as people who need to be intervened, need to take a stance, need to position themselves in the big challenges of the day. And as we know, contemporary migration is, and is going to be for many years to come, one of the greatest challenges that we as society today, as a world, are going to face. Not in the sense of a crisis, because I do not really believe on the concept of migration crisis. I believe that what we see today, let's say Europe, is not a migration crisis, is a crisis of reception, as other colleagues have also said, is a crisis to do with the identity of the Europeans themselves. And it is a crisis of Europe in its inability to deal with its own colonial past, its own haunting. And I will say more about the notion of haunting later. So these are some of the thoughts in terms of how the past kind of relates to the contemporary moment today in my own work.
Wonderful. And I think as we move now to the second question, even more of the second book will come into picture. And what I'd like to ask is, so how is the work done? How do you do the work? What kind of teams? What kinds of methods? What kind of collaborations do these projects involve? I mean, yours particularly, and of the others in the volume and in the project, with refugees, with organizations.
As you know, contemporary archaeology is now a thriving field globally. And it's also a field that has a kind of long history, even people that don't realize it. I mean, some of our audience may know that one of the first projects on contemporary archaeology was actually the Tucson Garbage Project in 1973, so nearly half a century ago. Since then, it has actually grown, has become a very dynamic and thriving field within archaeology. And there are now different perspectives on how to deal with it and how to do contemporary archaeology. At the beginning, it was more like an archaeology of the present. It was, to my liking, more a presentist archaeology, to my mind, and I think that was problematic. At the moment, many of our colleagues do contemporary archaeology that is more multi-temporal. It is not presentist. It tries to understand different temporalities and their links to materiality. In terms of the archaeology of contemporary migration, it is an emerging, and I hope a growing kind of subfield within contemporary archaeology. There is a lot of work being done by our colleagues on the Mexico-US border, one of the major borderlands between the global south and the global north. And there are other projects, fewer projects around the world. The Mediterranean, our geographical focus, as we know, is one of the, perhaps the largest geographically border between the global south and the global north, and also, and this is important, the deadliest. The one where most border crossers have perished, especially on the central Mediterranean route from the North African coast to Italy or to Spain or to to other countries. So that focus alone needs actually makes us reflect and think on what actually needs to be done in that specific border. Now, one of the kind of phenomena that we observe in relation to global migration is its materialization, its materiality, the fact that borders, walls, fences become more prominent materially, but also sensorially, kinesthetically. They prevent people, objects, and animals and others to actually move across the landscape. That very explicit rematerialization of the border in a very profound way speaks to many of our archaeological concerns and sensibility. So that is one of the starting points in actually engaging with it. In terms of how I do my own work on my context of study, which is Lesbos, I combine many of the methodologies and techniques and other procedures that colleagues in social anthropology, but also colleagues in archaeology use. I have defined in the past archaeological ethnography as a space of sharing and as a space of encounter. So in that sense, I do not have a very rigid, nor very strict, nor very detailed methodological framework when I started work. A lot of what I do involves improvisation, involves change, and involves response to the realities on the ground. I'm also very clear that this is as much an activist project as it is an epistemic scholarly project. What I mean by that is that for me, the social and the political realities of the border are of paramount importance, and my desire to have an impact, first of all, to be there to witness and be able to talk, but also express solidarity with the people who are trying to cross national borders is for me very, very important. So very often the epistemic dimension, the dimension of recording, keeping notes, or trying to understand the situation takes backseat when specific actions of activist nature, of solidarity nature, need to be foregrounded, need to be prioritized. A lot of the time, I've gone to Lesbos since 2016. I go to Lesbos twice, in January and in the summer. I stay for a few weeks every time, and I will continue going for many years to come. I am not chasing a crisis here. I'm not jumping into any bandwagon. I'm not trying to make the most of a moment, which for Lesbos, it was 2015, in fact. But I'm trying to understand this phenomenon in the long run. That's why I'm going to continue going and interacting with many people there. I also emphasize the collaboration here. So for many years now, one of my key aims was to establish links, collaborations, which are actually have become, for many of them, for many of those people, long-lasting kind of communication, collaboration, and even friendship with many of those people. Once in 2017, I collaborated also with graduate students from Brown University, and we were able to do specific archaeological work, for example, at the so-called Live West Cemetery on the north of Lesbos, in recording that context as an archaeological site, in trying to understand that secondary archaeological deposition as an assemblage that can help us understand the whole phenomenon of border crossing. But most of the time, I go there on my own, but I develop, as I said, links, collaborations, and I often work collaboratively with many others, including people involved in various local initiatives. I want to finish by saying something brief on the 3 or 4 phrases that you outlined, which is from the introduction of the book: the material, sensorial, epistemic, affective, and archival. In terms of archival, I don't want to replicate archaeological definitions of the record. I do not want to impose on that specific kind of context ideas that even in archaeology are now under reconsideration and critique. For example, the notion of the record as something that we as archaeologists take care of, preserve, conserve, perpetuate, house in archives and museums. For me, the materiality of contemporary migration is active and continuous and should be active in perpetuity. So what do I do is engage not with the record, but with material components of a larger assemblage, the assemblage of the border and the assemblage of contemporary migration, which also includes many facets, including the securitization apparatus, the camps, the detention centers, and many other material facets and edifices. Finally, if I was to write that introduction today, I would have added an additional thread, a meta thread, and that's an ontological thread. I believe that this phenomenon and this work we are doing with this phenomenon is of fundamental ontological nature. It needs to question our own constitution of ourselves as human beings, as beings in general, as societies, as political entities in terms of nation states. And I think it needs to put a mirror in front of us to actually force us to reconsider the long histories of colonization that tightly link to what we're seeing today. That's why I want to come back and finish with the notion of haunting. I believe that haunting as a process and as an ontology, what Derrida would call hauntology, is fundamental in what we do. We have to live with that haunting. We have to actually be able to come to terms with what Europe, what whiteness, what the racialized order of this world has done, and what we're seeing today in terms of contemporary migration is another episode of that long history of racialized colonization. Sorry, I've spoken for far too long.
No. Thank you very much. And we're going to see in a second various examples of what you just said. And I just like to remind everybody who's tuning in that if you have any questions, you can already post them, type them, and send them to us, and we'll see them as they come. There's no need to wait for the the end of the first half of this presentation. So what I'd like to do now, Yanis, is to one second. What I'd like to do now is just to show how the exhibit that is now in the Hafenreffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown University that you curated presents and presents some of these issues. And it's online, and you can see now in the chat box a link to the exhibition. And we hope that at some point in the fall, right, Yanis? It might hopefully it might be reopened again for actual visiting. And it concentrates mostly on several sites in Lesbos. The Lifes Cemetery, which we'll see in a second here, Mytilene Moria camp here, Mytilene Airport. And it has several threads. One, it has the kind of the thread of the border crossings and the material remnants of border crossings, art making as world making, art making and world making, and finally the exhibition, the exhibiting of materiality and of exactly what Yanis just said, rather than creating, cataloging, and preserving and conserving a record, engaging the materiality of the assemblage of the border and of the border crossing. So here, for example, we see various lifests that come from the Lifes Cemetery, which is the site that started as a landing site and turned into a landfill of lifests of people who are crossing. Many cases, those lifests actually don't work, right? They're not, how do you say, they don't have the buoyancy capacity that the people who sell them promise them to have. Other items that present this kind of material trajectories are tubes of tubes of truck tires that are used in as items in the crossing. Again, collected at the Leifes Cemetery. Another aspect is the securitized border itself, or the securitized spaces of detention and deterrence regarding the border, together with the graffiti and the presentation of relationship to them on the in this case on the wall itself. And this is at the entrance to the Moria Registration and Processing Center, next in eastern island of Lesbos. Another aspect that comes strongly, and Yanis, if you want to say a couple words of it, is the, how do you say, the emergence of with the expansion of the number of border crossers and the people who are made to stay in Moria, was vastly overflown because of policies, Greek policies and European policies that keep people from being able to access processing in the Greek mainland. The first overflow is called the olive grove in this case, where migrants for Afghanistan call it the jungle, where they actually come to occupy as a form of living other spaces of near the camp. Another way that it comes forth strongly is the, how do you say, multiplicity of residents, of types of residents, from the container, transformed container to the tent, as in this picture adjacent to the containers. Would you like to say a couple of words about this project? These are pictures not taken by you. These are pictures that are actually a part of an interactive project, a collaborative project.
Thank you for giving a very, very good overview of the exhibition called Transient Matter, Assemblages of Migration in the Mediterranean. So I want to emphasize the two words in the title that I think is crucial in our own logic and thinking about this exhibition. The one is transience, the notion of transience. The idea not only of evoking mobility and border crossing, but also of evoking the transience of matter. The thing that these things are transient and need to continue being transient. That's why I am kind of skeptical and reluctant of them becoming permanently housed in museums and exhibitions. I would rather see them as kind of keep moving, as they have moved some of them, for example, from Lesbos to Providence for this exhibition, and continue moving to other places. An assemblage, because we wanted to foreground the many different actors, some living and sentient, others material, that actually make the whole assemblage work. Assemblage not only as an assemblage of material things, but as a co-presence of diverse material and immaterial entities, from the legal apparatus to the material apparatus of detention, to the many social actors, many people and groups involved, to the many different objects that come to constitute the assemblage of migration. We're also very keen to show the brutality of the border regime, but not focus exclusively on border crossing, because we wanted to see what else was happening there, and there's a lot happening. You mentioned Moria, which is the largest, in fact, refugee camp in Europe. At the moment, it houses 20,000 people, and many things are happening there. As we know, there are things that to do with the apparatus of the state and the European Union, but also there's a lot happening which is due to the agency, due to the initiative, due to the resilience of migrating people. There are lots of schools and other initiatives, in fact, that have started because of the will and the energy and the agency of migrants themselves. There is a painting school by one of the painters we actually show in the exhibition. There are many attempts to bypass as much as possible the brutality and the securitization regime of the state and of the European Union. So we wanted to show some of that initiative. That's why we focused on Moria, not only on the security apparatus, but also on the other initiatives. And that's why we had a third theme, which is to do with art, migrating people producing art. This photography exhibition, the Polaroid photos, are photos taken from inside Moria that I did not have access to by young teenage people from Afghanistan mostly. And the remit was, the question was, show us what Moria is to you. So you can go through and see the details. You can see also the difference between my own take, photographic take, and their own photographic take of the details of their daily life inside that camp.
And other parts of the artworking as world making have show in the exhibition, and in the online version of the exhibition, you can zoom in into various aspects of it. In this case, the artifacts like t-shirts and bags, and then finally a focus on Shukran Shahzad, the artist you just mentioned, and some of his work. It reads, if you can read, and again you can see it in the exhibition. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land.
Yeah. This is a quotation from a poem that Shukran actually repainted on his painting here, and this is another painting by him. I found this extremely interesting in terms of the visual economy of migration, something we didn't talk about, because another kind of early finding of my my work, and I'm sure many other colleagues have also found this, is that Lesbos is at the same time a stage. It has become a global stage where many of the kind of rituals of humanitarianism are being performed. It's become also a stage for politicians, for celebrities, for other personalities. So one of my kind of aims is to go behind the stage, to actually observe the details of and routines of daily life that are not projected in that highly visualized performative projection that we often see of Lesbos and of Moria.
And finally, there are for example, these safe passage bags produced by Lesbos Solidarity that are made of upcycled materials made out of the life.
Yeah, a good indication of how that material kind of remnants of border crossing is constantly being on the move, right? It's being upcycled and recycled, and people want to engage with it in many different ways. It's interesting, there is a lot of discussion here on how people on the border treat this material. So we are negotiating in that exhibition, in our writings, that kind of transition very often between rubbish and something valuable. For some people, these, life jackets and others are pollution on beaches. For us, are very interesting affective objects that can actually be engaged with in many other ways, including in upcycling projects as we're seeing here. And finally, I want to kind of issue a warning that very often these objects may not necessarily be as important to migrating people themselves. In one of the articles, the one by Yorgos Tirikos, in the book, it is clear from ethnographic interviews that many border crossers do not really want to see a life vest again in their own life. Because for them, the moment of the crossing at sea is a very short episode in a long journey that started months or even years ago. So we have to be clear and have to be aware of how different material objects and assemblages may have very different meanings to us compared, let's say, to migrating people or to others.
And to that, I can only add that if we look since 2015, especially the summer of 2015, what you talked about before about the need to represent or recenter the discussion about the relationship between current undocumented migration and the history of colonialism, colonization, and imperial relations. The emphasis on the boat, the emphasis on the water, either in the Aegean or even more so in the Central Mediterranean, actually helps cancel the questions of what brought people to sea, because it stages the relationship of reception and purported hospitality as a relationship of no questions asked, instead of no questions are asked. You come from some, why? Because you are a refugee. What is the relationship of the people who claim to host you or will not give you hospitality to your seeking refugee? Well, maybe they participated in that war, etc., etc. So
of course. Yeah, of course, that's very important. You've done a lot of interesting work yourself on the Central Mediterranean route in relation to that, but also the notion of the sea and of the ship, again, reminds us of many other historical episodes of forced migration in the world, including, of course, as in a fundamental kind of a process in the constitution of the racialized world, which is the slavery and the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
So in fact, some artists and others are making already these links, and I think these links need to be made.
So we have a couple of minutes more before we open it up to questions, and I'd like to ask you about where do you see this kind of work going? What even in the project itself, there are multiple voices and multiple approaches. And if you can see from that moment onwards, where do you see this kind of work going in the future, in your work, in the field? Yeah,
I think we have only just started. And as I said, this is my 5th year on that project. So for me, a lot of work needs to be done from now on. For the last 5 years, the main focus was, as I said, in establishing collaborations. I think we have still a lot to do in understanding the specifics of the material dimension of migration, let's say, for example, on Lesbos. To give you an example, Moria as the context, I mentioned it already. I keep going there for 5 years, and I'll go for many, many years in the future, and I still really do not understand how that specific assemblage works, how specific materiality works, because of its complexity, because of its transience, because of its kind of accelerated change all the time, and because of the multiplicity of functions that actually that specific context serves. So in doing more work and spending more time in actually aiming for the long term is, I think, for me, fundamental. That's why I think there is that work needs more time. The other dimension is to see how we can make the most and kind of foreground and facilitate even and collaborate with many of the projects that migrants themselves are doing. Yeah. For example, there is a very active NGO on the island, and we collaborated for this exhibition called Refocus Media Labs. The colleagues who are actually doing that work aim at training migrants on photography and on filmmaking. And they have already produced some very, very interesting photographic and filming works. And I think many of these projects are going to emerge in the future as well. So how can we not only be there and record it, but also facilitate it, provide more venues, provide more channels for that work to be shown, to be known, to be exhibited, is another facet, another dimension I would like this work to take.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's move to some of the questions that people sent us in. The first is, how do you imagine this study's results, or actually, how would you imagine this kind of work changing after the pandemic? How would COVID-19 change the archaeology of migration?
Yeah, that's very interesting, very challenging. It gives me an opportunity to say one or two words about the pandemic and the camps right now. People who follow the developments of Lesbos know that people are still on lockdown. So even if officially the country has opened and has opened its borders to tourists, and people have started gaining some sort of normality in the country, people in the camps are not really allowed to leave their camps unless they ask for very special permission, which is actually issued rarely. So they are still in lockdown. They are still kettled in many ways in those camps, supposedly in an effort to protect them. But at the same time, of course, it is a de facto way of creating closed camps, which is actually one of the aims of this specific Greek government at the moment. So that's a first direct impact on the lives of these people. In terms of how it is going to affect our work, it is, I think, going to have similar impact to many other fieldwork, anthropological and archaeological fieldwork. So it's going to make it more difficult to have regular face-to-face interactions with people. But we are continuing interacting with many of those people online. And I think one of the key facets of this contemporary kind of episode of migration is that most migrants, if not all of them, are, of course, as technologically or more savvy than you and I are, and they're constantly present online. They're constantly willing to engage online. Many of us probably watching us now. So I think allowing that kind of communication to continue via digital media is going to be important. Of course, I can't wait to go back to Lesbos because I think we cannot replace that face-to-face interaction with people, interacting, not only talking, but also sharing meals together and reflecting and thinking about the situation.
Thank you. Another question from Argiro Nicolaou. In the process of studying or engaging with the phenomenon, especially with a phenomenon like this, invariably we produce the I, or the we, the studying subject, and the studied object, the them. If we are committed to dismantling the colonial history of Europe and of the United States and Australia, and by extension the Eurocentric nature of academic institutions, how do we blur those lines between the us and the them? This is especially important when working on migration, which, as you mentioned before, is a phenomenon that triggers the production of otherness at the border in the context of nationalism as in service of nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with the implicit kind of thesis of this question, and that's why I've said that collaboration is key here. Collaboration with migrating people, collaboration with border crosses is key here. And that collaboration should not only involve discussing together or doing things together or initiatives at the border together, should actually also involve study and publication. I would like to see, and I think I'm trying to do that right now with colleagues, is to have some of our key collaborators on the project on Lesbos co-authoring, co-publishing some of that work with us. And I think that is doable and it can be done. They do have the ability, they do have the knowledge, of course, much more than we do of what's happening out there. And I think that, for me, is crucially important. The work on the live West cemetery that I mentioned was done as a group work involving myself, involving graduate students from Brown, involving colleagues from local NGOs, and involving migrating people themselves. And the other, just to finish in relation to that, is to actually rethink everything, including the terminology we use. So I've tried to avoid as much as possible in this conversation the use of the term migrant. Mm-hmm. And we could go on discussing the bipolarity between migrant and refugee, which, as we know, is fraught with epistemic and political kind of traps and issues. And I've chosen the word instead of migrating people or border crosses, because I want to emphasize that experience as one facet of their own life, not something that defines them, not something that actually becomes an essential quality of their being, because it's not. They are academics, they are artists, they are shop owners, they are farmers, there are others that currently live on Lesbos on the way to another country. So these are two of the issues that I would like to work through, and I would like to collaboration and then rethinking of everything, including our own epistemic tools and our own labels.
So actually, to continue on that line, and then I go back to other questions. How does archaeology of undocumented migration looks like when the people you work with don't even have a temporary home? For example, migrants in Athens, who are not even housed in camps and shelters. How can you engage? How can you interact, represent?
Many of the people I've met on Lesbos are now on the move. They're now on the road. They're now en route. And our communication continues, though. Our communication through Messenger, through other online media continues. Sometimes some of them, they decide to go completely underground. They don't want to be visible in media. And of course, we do respect that and understand that as their own strategy. But I think not having a permanent home in Athens is not actually something that prevents us from engaging with them as they travel en route. Yeah, it is, in the old days, we used to call it a multi-sided ethnography. Now, of course, it's something else. It's a multimodal and many more besides. So I think that is something that will happen more and more in the future.
And actually, how do you say this? This is connecting to the next question from Nairoz Khatum about can you imagine? Are you imagining the archive of migrating people to be transient itself, or as she puts it, it's related to the temporality that is being redefined in archaeology.
Yeah.
In specific, the notion of archaeology of the present. How does the future is being imagined? Future movement, the future is imagined also in relationship to the multiple temporalities that you examine, that you open up in the assemblage of the border.
Yeah, there are two issues there. One is to do with how do we imagine a potential archive of the contemporary moment, which I think is a very important question. And the second issue is how does this work make us rethink of our own conception of temporality, especially in relation to future and futurity. For the first one, I think an archive of the contemporary migration is a concept and an issue that we are actually developing right now, and there are lots of different kind of perspectives on it. As I said, I do want heritage organizations to take note of it as an important material dimension of our contemporary world, but I do not want them to use their own established techniques of accession, of preservation, conservation, and permanent kind of storage. I want to find different ways of producing these objects as on the move as well. So that's why I think this exhibition that you saw is going to travel. After it finishes at the Hafer, it's going to go into other places. So these things will continue moving from Lesbos to Providence to other parts of the US, perhaps to Europe, in sending that message that transience is in fact key also in our own thinking about archiving and about kind of museifying in some ways, although we do want to avoid all the dangers of museification that we have seen in other facets of heritage of archaeology. As for the challenges in our own senses of temporality, I think they're immense. I think this archaeology and this kind of work forces us to, as I said from the beginning, actually abandon the archaeos in the concept of archaeology, abandon the idea that we are studying antiquity. No, we are not. We are studying things from diverse times. We're studying matter that embodies multiple times at the same time. And within that, we need to imagine a futurity and a future that I believe that should be a haunted futurity, something that cannot actually abandon the previous moments, abandon the moments of colonization, the moments of racialized capitalism, the moments of the establishment of nation state. All these moments need to be there as ghosts, as things that will haunt us. So it's going to be a future that will incorporate that haunting from the past.
We have 3 more minutes and many questions. So I'll start with the question by Rosa Silva. She was wondering what were your views on immigration in America and the narrative that vilifies immigrants of color, and I would add, how does that unfold in the materialities that the project examines?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is a key question. I mean, we live in a settler colony, as we know, in the United States. So there's a history of colonization that shaped this country, and then there's a history of the forced migration of slavery that actually, again, shaped the racial reality of the world today. And of course, we are seeing also on the southern border of this country, especially, we are seeing kind of a movement of people who want to come to this country, and we are seeing the xenophobic and racist attacks by ICE, by federal government, by many agents. The hope is that there are other reactions, there are initiatives. There are so many solidarity initiatives, as we know, in this country. There are also many colleagues, anthropologists and archaeologists, who are actually studying that phenomenon on that border, trying to make the brutality of the border regime of the Mexico-US border known more widely. So in terms of how it shapes our life today, as we know, as somebody who is still on a visa, as somebody who, I don't know if I'm going ever to get a green card or not, these things are constantly in my mind, but of course I'm much more privileged compared to many other people who are stuck in Moria or who are stuck on the southern border. So migration in this country is on the agenda daily, and rightly so.
Thank you. Another question from Christina Phoebe Thomopoulos. She asks, how you see language and linguistic norms creating borders, exclusions in their own ways? How can the academic or activist work done in the book and the work's next steps become accessible to communities speaking other languages and perhaps beyond the written word itself? Perhaps even rethinking the way of approaching books and publishing.
Yeah, words and languages, and I mean, one of the key facets of this work, key kind of starting principles, I would say, is the fact that oral testimonies, oral interviews, the classic ethnographic trope of speaking to somebody and listening to them may not necessarily be always the best way of understanding the phenomenon. So the foregrounding of materiality, of biographical objects, of things, of artifacts, relies also on that idea, on the limits of oral communication and written communication. There are also many other facets that Christina is bringing up. For example, how do we go beyond the kind of the dominance of English or the dominance of colonial languages? And of course, that means that all of us need to be able to communicate in many other languages beyond the usual European ones that we actually train our students to be. One of the key kind of positive facets of this lockdown in Providence and the Hafen exhibition is that it forced us to make that exhibition fully online, and it forced us to make it also constantly interactive in an effort to engage everybody, including many migrating people who will be able to leave their comments, to leave their reactions, leave their own kind of take on the matter. And we're in the process of actually translating that online exhibition into Arabic and Farsi, and later into Greek and French as well.
Well, we have various more questions that I'm afraid we cannot answer because we need to wrap it up. But other elements that we'll raise now in the questions and answer have to do with what kind of policy the recommendations can emerge out of this work that this work enables about the relationship to the people whose work are presented in the in an exhibition. And so forth. But again, unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. Thank you, Professor.
I'll take into account and think about them and find ways to respond in other occasions.
And again, I remind everybody that in the webinar chat you have more information both about the book and about the exhibition. And I thank Professor Yanis Chamilakis very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Naor, and thank you to everybody who is listening, who's watching us.